you Professor Bob Brown, and he's the head of the School of Architecture and Design and Construction here. Head of Architecture.
Associate
Head of Architecture, Design and Construction in Plymouth University.
Yes.
And already from 3 years. And so I think this is a very good opportunity for you for at least 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, because Professor Brown, we don't introduce very much, but he deals with some of the topics we are interested in. And so I think that the lecture today is fitting very much your work. You are working on the analysis, and I feel like you are very so much distant from us. Can you please come here? Please, oh, the students are not the assistants. Students, please. And so I think you will get some good ideas for making your program, functional social program related to the analysis. As you know, traditionally in Italy we start from analysis, and so the project is a result of an analysis process that is based on many variables, of course. And secondly, I think we can organize a debate and we make some review. And for one group from composition, and one group from Professor Wooding course of landscape. And so I ask you today to participate very much in the debate. I think this is a trial to give Chinese students and also foreign students a different view of European architectural cultures and debate, because of course you learn from us our approach, but other European schools contribute differently and with different tools and different history maybe to the debate, to the contemporary debate of architecture and which are the goals of architecture nowadays. So thank you very much, and I'll let you lecture against.
Thank you. Thank you. Firstly, I want to say thanks to Professor Del Sante and his colleagues for their very kind invitation to speak to you today, also for their very generous hospitality last night and today, and for wonderful tour guide earlier today. It's all been very, very generous and very much appreciated. I'm going to ask a quick question. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? All right. I have a funny accent. It's American, but it's been anglicized after a number of years in living in England, where people tend to talk a bit softer and quieter. So I'll try to remind myself to speak loudly like Americans do, if that's okay. I will also try to take a lesson from the English and enunciate all my words very clearly and not fall into American slang. But if I do, and you're not understanding something, please raise your hand and ask me to clarify or repeat it. I'm very happy to do that. Okay? So I will get started. Again, thank you very much. I may be talking for, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes. Professor Del Sante said maybe an hour. I'll try perhaps to be a bit shorter to leave some time, more time for discussion. So hopefully I won't drag on too much. But I would like to begin with a little bit of a game. Sometimes I know that students can get very concerned. Oh my, this professor, this speaker is going to ask me to do something. This is a very personal game. You don't need to share it with anybody. It's partly because we were talking last night about the idea of teaching and learning, something I'm very interested in. And so I thought maybe I would begin by doing something that I often do with my students. So I'll explain this in a moment in terms of the teaching and learning or pedagogy behind it. It's a very simple game. What I want you to do, very quickly, just jot down on a piece of paper, or if you don't have a piece of paper, in your head, think of the roles that you play. And by roles, I mean student. Most of you are students, or teachers, father, husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, son, daughter, cousin, friends, an employee. Those are the sort of roles you might have. Maybe it's a volleyball player. Maybe it's someone who plays on their football team. What sort of roles do you participate in? And I'll just give you maybe 15 seconds just to quickly write that down or think about it. Right, so you have these things in your mind. My question is, in those different roles, do you behave the same way? Do you speak to your father or mother the way that you do to your friends? Do you speak to your little brother the way that you do to your boss? Do you speak to your colleagues on the volleyball pitch or whatever one calls it, I don't know, volleyball court, the same way that you might to someone that you meet in the street? Unless you're very, very different, I would think no. My point here is that we take on different roles in our life. I speak very differently to my wife than I do my boss. I speak very differently to my dad than I do my brothers. Increasingly, I'm speaking to my dad like he's my son or something, but that's another story. But my point in this is that we take on multiple roles. That's very common what we do. We behave a little bit differently. We are not a single individual. We have multiple identities. They're connected in some way, but we all have multiple identities. Again, father, son, mother, daughter, wife, whatever it may be. There's a point to that that's part of this lecture I'll get back to. But for reasons about this idea of pedagogy, and perhaps just picking up on our conversation last night, this is often how I begin teaching, by asking you guys something that you know. This is important because I want to begin with where you're starting from. Yes, I'm going to be talking about some things that I do as a teacher, that I do together with my students, but my first step as a teacher is always asking the students, what do you think? Where are you coming from? And it's about putting you on a kind of familiar ground to start. You're not starting where I want you to, in a way. I'm asking you to start with something you know. And that becomes a point of reference for what follows. So I hope that makes sense. And again, that's just picking up on some of the conversation I've had with professors last night and earlier today. I will now move on to this lecture, but keep in mind this idea of the multiple roles, multiple identities, because it is very much what I'm going to be talking about. And now here comes the tricky part. Right. There's always a moment of confusion there. So this is me many years ago. It doesn't look like me because that person in the middle has hair, so you can tell that it was many years ago. But it's part of my life. For a number of years, I was involved in community development work. I did work in India, in Kenya, Malawi, South Africa, in the east and south ends of London, very different environments. So here I am, this American, Midwestern, naive boy going into a very different world. People spoke differently, they acted differently, they had a different set of concerns than I had, which is very fair. I was the intruder, I was the visitor coming into their home ground. One of the key things that I found from that experience is this word, second word there, that says multiplicity. And by multiplicity, I mean the idea that, as I was just suggesting before, we have multiple identities. And we can expand that even bigger. Cultures have multiple aspects of it. It would be very dangerous of me to suggest to you as students all Italians are the same, or that all Chinese are the same. We know that people in China speak many different languages, and there's different cultural attitudes spread across the whole country. In the same way, I know that Lombardy and the people living in this region are very different from the people living in Sicily. Yes, they're all notionally Italians. Some of the food's similar, some of the customs are similar, but yet there's a lot of diversity. And this is something that I've taken from this experience that I've had of working in community development, the idea that there's multiple things in any one condition. It's not fixed, it's not a singular thing. The other thing that I've gained from that experience is the idea of joined up thinking. The problem in community development in many parts of what's often called the developing world is people have tried to apply a single solution. We will provide this new housing, that will provide the answer. These people are living in poor conditions, let's build them new houses based on a Western model and we'll drop it into place. As an architect working in those places, I found that that way of responding did not work. The only thing that consistently worked was where people thought not only about the housing, but also about how are people going to live? What sort of jobs are they going to do? If we provide them this new housing on the outside of town, where are they going to work? If we provide this new housing out there, where are their children going to go to school? And we can kind of go through a number of things about economic issues, political, social, cultural. All of these things are part of people's lives. And so joined up thinking, certainly in that context, was about saying, well, if we're providing housing, is there something that we can do in the project that also will provide them with jobs? Can we bring these different concerns together and provide a joined-up approach that will impact on people's lives in a very broad way, as opposed to just a single part of it? Because consistently, the projects I found in the places I mentioned before, Africa, India, England, when somebody tried to apply a singular solution, inevitably, and then it ended up having problems. The projects that worked were the ones that brought a number of issues together and addressed them in a very holistic way. So that's what I've gained from that experience, and that all factors into what I'm going to be talking about now. So, with that sort of background in mind, and I'll start to pick up the pace a bit now, there's a proposition I'm going to put forward to you today. It's about the idea of city as palimpsest. I'll go on to talk more about the word palimpsest in a moment. But city as palimpsest is a way of reading the city or analyzing the city. And I'm also going to talk about the idea of palimpsest as a way of thinking about the way that we work. So those are the two aspects of this talk. How we read or analyze the city, and how we then start to work with that reading in making things for the city. So, as a point of reference, this is what I'm against. This is a master plan by Zaha Hadid for an area in Bilbao, Spain called Zorozare, or Zorozare, depending on how you pronounce the Z. Zaha Hadid had prepared a master plan for this area. It was an extension along the river, further down from the world-famous Guggenheim Museum. And the people living in that existing community contacted my university and said, can you do something for us? Because we don't like this. The problem I have with it is what I refer to as geometric space. It's been designed on the basis of form. What does it look like? You know, and as an example of it, there's all these buildings that are kind of pointing somewhere over here. And actually, they're pointing nowhere. There's nothing over here that forms a common point. And actually, if you take the lines of these, they never meet up anyway. Somebody in Zaha Hadid's office, maybe Zaha herself, just liked the way it looked. It had nothing to do with the way of life of people, the people living there. It was just purely an exercise in form making. And it's a very absolute thing. Here's an answer for the whole of this island. This is, from here to the other end, is about 3 kilometers long. Huge amount of space. And here she is saying, here's the one answer for 3 kilometers of a city. Not recognizing the people that live there, not recognizing the topography, not recognizing their way of life. And it's also something that I would suggest is panoptic. Panoptic meaning an overview. The idea that you're looking down on it from above. And that's what's going on here. These are the views that are shown to the public. Look what it's like. So here's Zaha sitting up high, kind of designing what it looks like from above. Little consideration given to what it's like to live there, to be on the street. And I'm assuming I click this. Very good. Another thing that I'm against is the idea of tabula rasa, or translated into English, blank slate. The idea that we'll wipe out what's there and start over, putting in something new. And we will project onto it a brand new idea. And it's putting something in place that has what I would suggest is its own space and time. It defines its own space. It's based on people living in it at that particular moment. It forgets what's happened in the past. It's not necessarily looking towards the future. As it happens, this is the master plan for the city of Plymouth, where I come from, prepared by a man named Abercrombie back in 1939. The plan was officially released in 1943. Fortunately, if you're Mr. Abercrombie, the Germans came along in World War II and bombed all of Plymouth, so much of it was destroyed, though not all of it. Abercrombie took this as his chance to say, let's knock the whole city down and start over, and we'll put in my master plan. The other thing I have a problem with, and won't go into detail, is this is the area that's about government, civic things. That's shopping. Up here is educational, which actually is where Plymouth University is. And he segmented the city, very modernist thinking. That's where business is, that's where government is, etc. To this day, 70 years later, at 6 o'clock at night, this is dead. You don't want to walk through there. There's nobody there, except me, walking to catch my train. Everybody clears out because the business is all shut at 6 o'clock. The city's not trying to get student housing in there. But again, this idea, let's just wipe out everything that was there, we'll start over. Also, don't like this kind of thinking because it is reductive. It reduces things down. It abstracts things. It talks about geometry, it talks about an idea. It tends not to talk about what it means for people living there, their way of life, the way they interact with each other, their cultural concerns, and it tends to be totalizing. As in, everybody, once I build it, everybody's got to conform to my vision. You have to live my way. And it's a very kind of exclusive way of thinking. I'll forget about your concerns, I'll forget about your concerns, forget about your concerns. You all have to live my way. And that's what these things tend to be. It's about people conforming to somebody else's vision. And so people are marginalized by this. Certain groups, often those who are poorer, those with less money, those perhaps of certain cultural, ethnic backgrounds get excluded. And it also is decorporalized, meaning it doesn't really take account of the body and body experience. It's all meant to be something looked at, and it forgets what it's like to actually move through the city and occupy it and inhabit it. So these are a number of things that I'm reacting against, these sort of traditions. And in its place, I'm putting forward this proposition, the idea of the city as multiplicity. Recognizing just as individuals, we have always multiple roles. In cities, there's multiple things going on. We can't think of the city as one particular thing. It's many things happening simultaneously, and those things are constantly changing or in flux. So we need to recognize that the city is this incredibly dynamic thing. I mentioned before, I come back to the word palimpsest. Those of you that are conversant in Latin will recognize the Latin roots that actually comes out of the Greek word. A number of different definitions, but a simplified way of thinking about palimpsest is once upon a time, where the word came from, paper was very expensive, and people would write on it, but because it was so expensive, they would go back if they wanted to write something else, and they would either rub out or scrape out what they'd written before. But however much they did that, it always left a trace. And there's something about that metaphor that I've always liked, the idea that whatever I do, there's always a trace of what came before that's present. And that's the notion of palimpsest I'm referring to, that there's something that's there before. And the question is, can we start to work with that? Do we somehow preserve those traces or work off of, take inspiration from those? Some of the work I've been involved with has been looking at that idea. And it's taken inspiration from that sort of thinking. This image, which may or may not make sense, is a bar of soap sitting in a tray. This was actually part of a project I was doing with students, and from now on, the images that you're going to be seeing are student work. Students I've been working with over the last 8 years. In this particular project, talking to the students about the idea of home. And in some ways, this is kind of evocative of this particular student's notion of palimpsest, because this was the bar of soap in the flat she lived in and shared with 3 other people. So she shared the flat, she shared the bar of soap. And the idea that somebody would come along and use it, and then the next person would come along and the bar of soap had changed. Somehow it had been changed by that person before. So it's an interesting kind of notion of continuity, things passing on. So, city is palimpsest. Again, the idea that there are physical layers, like the paper that we've scraped, rubbed out. There's things that are present there. This is a student's drawing where she was looking at a streetscape, but identifying individual layers in that streetscape. But also those layers can be non-physical. They take place in space, but they can be very non-physical things. Economic exchange, social exchange. Sometimes that sort of non-physical activity does leave a physical mark in the landscape. But recognizing I'm not just talking about physical layering, I'm also talking about non-physical activity that starts to build up a presence. We know that if we go to this part of town at night, all the other students will be gathered there socializing. And it just becomes part of our memory, or part of our knowledge of the city. has a certain identity. Certain people that don't want to be around the students also know that's where they shouldn't go because of that activity. And that becomes part of that layering. So just trying to emphasize, this isn't only about the idea of physical layers. And so notions of memory, notions of time factor into this. Things build up over many years. Even if that activity is no longer present, we can still say, well, back in 1962 or 10 years ago, that happened here. Sometimes we leave markers. Walking around today with Georgia, saw the idea of a marker in the landscape that we called the tower that was outside the Domo, so it's a very distinct marker present. Other times those markers aren't there, but yet in our memory we're aware of them, and these things build up over time. Also, various filters that we have, notably personally. There's things that we as an individual may know. There's things that we share communally, but also things individually we do. And that, there's perhaps an official, authorized view of the city. There's a view of the city that's shared between different people, but also we have our own particular view based on our own individual experiences. And sometimes, as individuals or collectively, we can start to leave marks. Kevin Lynch would argue in the book, What Time Is This Place? That's the most significant way that people connect with a city, the idea that or with a place. They've left a somehow mark in that place to kind of take ownership or somehow connect with it. Further to this sort of thinking is the idea of what I would call convergence and divergence. We've got this dynamic city condition where all these things are happening. And my suggestion is sometimes those things overlap, sometimes they diverge. And for me, those places where there's convergence or divergence present opportunity to act. Maybe it's in that gap that by providing something, I can create a linkage where one doesn't exist. Or maybe where there's an overlap, there's enough critical mass that I can start to feed off of that. And the projects that I'm going to be talking about will expand upon this. But conceptually, it's this idea of either those overlaps or gaps provide an opportunity. This image was actually some students doing a work, their mapping of the city, and they were tracing what happened in terms of a fish in the sea swimming about to the fish ending up on their plate for dinner. And I apologize, it's not very big, but all of these things are activities, people, that somehow got involved with the fish getting to their plate. Obviously, there's the idea that they bought it at the market. But yet they also had to go to another place to buy perhaps some salt and pepper or some other seasonings to put on the fish. And of course they had to go down the street to get a bottle of wine to go with the fish. So suddenly all these different people are becoming involved. And you go back through it and you suddenly realize there's a lot of people connected. There's the fisherman that goes out to catch the fish. Okay, good. But that fisherman has to buy petrol for his boat. So now there's another person involved. And he's got to go buy ice to keep the fish packed in ice from the time he catches it until he gets it to market. And there's somebody who repairs his nets. So you can suddenly see what happens if the fishing stock, the number of fish available in the sea, goes down. It doesn't just affect the fishermen. It affects the guy who makes nets. It affects the guy who makes petrol. It affects the guy who provides ice, because he's getting money from it. It affects the woman in the market who's selling the fish. And their point was, look at all the things that are involved just in a fish. And then we start to think about what happens with a watch or any other sort of things. There's a lot of things that become connected. That's the nature of our world. You've got an American speaking to you in a room that has students from Italy, from China, and I don't know where else. That's the nature of the world today. My university has 40% international students, and interestingly, 40% international staff. That's the way of the world. Things are so increasingly connected. And in the same way, that's the argument I'm making about the city. Things are connected, and there's opportunities where things are either connecting or not quite connecting. Also very important in this is recognizing, as Henri Lefebvre would argue, space is constructed. It's not just some kind of entity we find, particularly built in the built environment in our cities, but rather someone sat down and said, I'm going to make it in a certain way. There's a certain set of beliefs or ideology behind it. It is not politically free. Somebody's got a certain intention about it, for good, for bad, that's the debate, but there's some particular ideology that underlies it. And something about power, because somebody had to have the power to put it in place. Sometimes what they're putting in place is meant to be very controlling, other times not so controlling. But space is not free, it's not neutral, it's been constructed, and there's a set of intentions behind it, something we can't forget. So, talking about palimpsest, I have to quickly note there are related manifestations or examples of people doing things like this. The situationists were dealing with some similar thoughts. Ian McCarg, in talking about design with nature, was doing his own sort of activities about trying to find convergence and divergence, looking at landscapes, mapping them, and then bringing that mapping together to find opportunities. Collage City, in its own way, was talking about this idea of layering. More recently, landscape urbanist, industrial ecologist, synergetic urbanism, symbiotic urbanism, use whatever words. What I'm trying to suggest is the things I'm saying I don't see as revolutionary, far from it. What I am recognizing is there's a lot of thoughts that I've kind of been inspired by, I've taken thoughts from. There's a lot of things out there. There's a certain commonality, though, about how people are talking about these issues. So what I want to go on to is talking about working with this multiplicity. And part of the idea is about revealing. And this is notably where analysis comes in. I'll be giving some examples about that. And also, in looking at the city, trying to identify the potential. My intention in talking about this is not to suggest that one will find the one right answer, because I don't believe that exists. It would run contrary to the idea of multiplicity. However, what we're trying to do is find opportunities in looking at the city in this way. So, my point of reference in this is Plymouth University and the Master of Architecture program, which I was running for 5 years and then stepped away from that to become head of architecture for the last 3 years, but still have an input into that studio. And so my experience of this idea of palimpsest draws upon things we've been doing in the MArch studio, something that we've been asking our students to work with. So the images are drawn from that work. Also, very important to note, all the work that we've been doing in the Master of Architecture studio is based around what I would call live projects. We have clients, we're working with a local government. For the past 7 years, we've been working with the city of Plymouth. We've worked with city and regional government in Bilbao, in San Sebastian in Spain, and Oporto, a number of different places. And that informs very much what we do, and we're now approached by those cities saying, can you work with us? So that in some ways those people are setting the agenda together with the students. We go into these places, it's very open-ended, and it's partly about what people there are saying to us, and partly about how students are making sense of that determines what we do for the year. Also, to note, the places that we're working are in what I would call post-industrial landscapes, something very common in the UK. Arguably, you can find that in places in Italy, where areas of the city where there's a lot of industry. In the UK, you can find lots of spaces now where that industry existed, but it's kind of worn down. People are out of jobs, the factories aren't working. What do you do with that space? Those are the types of places that we're working in. Also in this, already made allusion to this, see ourselves as something of a mobile studio, or as the students suggested, a little box that they put together to take with them to project sites and talk with people, the mobile ideas factory. This is just some of the places we've been working over the last 7 years. So I'm going to talk about one particular project that we're working on, and I will talk about 2 students' projects within that. The place we were working was, in effect, an island called Andre Sala in Riga, Latvia. So, top left-hand corner in black, you can see Latvia in the context of Europe, much larger map of Latvia, and then this Riga is in here, which is several kilometers from the coast, and then the island of Andre Sala was here. I recognize now it's not very big, but it was about a 40-hectare site that was an industrial site just north of the city center and on the Daugava River. So that was kind of the place that we were working. The developer was a consortium of people from Scandinavian countries, and they were investing, and they had bought this island, and they wanted to turn it into kind of mixed-use development. A lot of housing, restaurants, shops, cafes, and because you can't have a mixed-use development of this scale, certainly 10 years ago you couldn't, without some sort of cultural facility, they're going to have a major museum located on this island. And they got Rem Koolhaas to come in and prepare a master plan. All systems go, and then we got to 2008, and things just went. Money disappeared. There was no money to kind of take it forward. And that's where we came in. The developer said, what can you guys do? Because we've had different people working on this, but all these ideas of this, what's called Cappuccino City, where you walk around drinking your cappuccino, going to the gallery, going shopping, that's not going to happen. Huge economic crisis in Latvia that was happening back in 2008. Bottom dropped out. What are we going to do? And that's the question the developer is asking us. What can you guys do for us? Putting it into context, Riga itself is very much an example of multiplicity, socio-culturally and economically and politically. If you look at Riga's history, it was founded by Germans. Then, at various points in its history, the Swedish controlled it, the Polish controlled it, the Germans again, the Russians had a brief period of independence in the early 20th century, and then the Germans took it over again. And then the Russians took, or actually the Soviet Union, not the Russians, Soviet Union took it over again. And then the Soviet Union later became the Russians. And it was only in mid-1990s that Latvia finally gained its independence and Riga became free. But you talk about Riga, what's Latvian, what's Rigan, who knows, because it's got this huge, tremendous history, and that's all present in the city. Economically, politically, it's got ties, even though it's tried to push Russia away, it's still economically tied together with Russia. And interestingly, increasingly, it's tied to China, because they see that as a place to kind of connect to. And they see an opportunity for them to connect up with business in China and become something of a gateway into Eastern Europe. So even though on one hand they're trying to say, okay, we've got independence, we're now Latvians, actually they're still connected with so many different things. So some examples of drawings, I'm just going to quickly flip through these. These will perhaps make a bit more sense, but some of the things that students were doing in Riga in terms of their way of mapping the city and kind of project proposals. And the work that we're doing dealing with a 43-hectare site, eventually the students design a building. But what they're also doing is designing a building in the context of some sort of urban strategy they've developed for the development of the city. What can they come up with some sort of proposition that will impact, that will improve the economy, social, cultural, ecological life of the city. Within that context, they do the design of the building. And this idea of layering, see that's quite present in the way they're starting to map things, and also perhaps a bit more of a general drawing. But you can see Andre Sala up here, and then the city center is right around here. So it was literally right on the doorstep. And the plan was to move the old port that had been on Andre Sala and all the industry downstream towards the Gulf of Riga. So now I'm going to talk about two projects that students have done. We began the year by doing a project called At Home in the City. Earlier I was talking about the students' bar or so, same project. We're asking students to think about how do we make ourselves at home in the city. We talk about our home as an individual dwelling, but we can also say, as I might, Chicago's home is where I'm from originally, or I now live in Exeter, Exeter's home. But what do I actually do to feel at home in the city? So we're asking students to analyze where they were from and make some sense of that. The student was picking up on the landscape of Cornwall, where he's from. He's a farmer, so he tends to think not so much in the context of the city. And he was thinking about all the things that have historically happened in Cornwall in terms of farming, mining, and all the sort of economic activity that sustained it, and the markers that have been left behind. If you travel in Cornwall now, you can see these rather famous old chimney stacks and buildings that are leftovers of the mining and industrial era. And this was a collage he was making that was trying to make sense of that. Another student was doing something different, talking about the idea of home. And there's a lot of text in here, but he's trying to make sense of the kind of political, economic underpinnings of the city and how he feels at home in it. And this was just a very quick project we did at the beginning to really get students thinking about this idea of how do you make home, how do you start to inhabit the city. The second project we did was when we went to Riga, something we called Mapping the City. And we asked the students to look at the city and try and make sense of it, not by trying to think of it as a single unified image, but rather understanding all the different activity in it. And they were given a specific task: map social activity, map economic activity, map political activity, map ecological activity. And in mapping this, these different layers, bring them together and see what happens. And the students were doing this in teams, and one team, and that team included the guy from Cornwall that did that collage. I'll be talking about his project in a moment. His team generated this image, and they were talking about the idea that the city center, the old town, was trying to project this image of being a kind of tourist mecca. This is where you come to be a tourist, to go to restaurants, shops, bars. They're kind of making a bit of a joke about it, the I Love Riga t-shirt, the smiley face. Of course we all go there and we're happy to be tourists. Forget about the idea that people once upon a time lived there, because we're getting them out. Think of modern day Riga becoming something like modern day Venice when nobody lives. Let's get them all out, it's just a place for tourists. What was interesting in their mapping is they found that there was an official tour bus sponsored by the city government. And that official tour bus that went through the city not only stopped at things like the cathedral or famous buildings from the history of Riga, but it also stopped at officially sanctioned bars, restaurants, and shops. So there's an interesting convergence of how economic activity got tied together with a set of political ambitions. Now, what happened to the other shops that weren't officially sanctioned, I don't know, but the official tour bus went and then stopped right outside saying, well, here's the shop that you can go to. So it's interesting how economics and politics come together. Meanwhile, this other student that I've been talking about, who did the project that said home and the little orange house on it, he and his colleagues were mapping a different part of the city, and what they found was a real split of ethnicity. In areas that were of higher economic value, where the homes had been improved, if somehow it looked better, that was also the place where you found English and Latvian on the menus. Meanwhile, when you moved into the other part of town, which was visually looking not so good, that there was less economic activity, that's where you found menus in Latvian and Russian. So it was a rather interesting kind of split across the town, and different types of economic activity, different physical presence that the thing had, different types of cars parked outside of buildings. And so recognizing that, again, the city's not one continuous, unified thing, there's multiple things going on. So, just a reminder, here we are, Andre Sala, this island, former industrial site. Some of it's still functioning when we were there. Had a huge power plant sitting in the middle of it, some grain elevators, and various production taking place on it. Huge bit of land, 43 hectares. So the first student I'm going to talk about, which again is the guy that was from Cornwall, looking at historical things in the city, went away, and when he started work on this project, started mapping the layers, looking at the history, what's happened there over time. And one of the things that he found out, which is quite interesting, is if you go back long enough, there's barely anything of Andre Sala at all. All it was